Thank you very much for these kind remarks. I'm going to talk today about this rationality and reason. And I first wanted to obviously thank the advisors. I think it's an excellent idea to create such a center on complexity, and it's very nice to speak here to you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. I'll try to limit myself to maximally an hour or so that we after that have enough time to discuss. I think what makes complexity so attractive is its dual relevance. It's one major scientific challenge and also of enormous practical relevance for the survival of mankind, because if we cannot learn how to cope with complexity, I think the prospects are not too positive. In my talk, I will basically touch upon two rather different things which are, however, interrelated via this challenge to understand and master complexity. The first is I will introduce some philosophical findings that emerged over the last 30 years and that argue for a rather fundamental rethinking of our appreciation of time and reality. And the argument is only if we manage to do this properly, we can then be able to also tackle complexity in a more promising form than we sometimes do today. So the overall architecture will be, and I'm coming to that in a second, this twofold structure, some rather fundamental stuff on the foundations of science, and then the practical application of these findings in terms of how we can improve our understanding and capability to master complexity. Just a few remarks on the notions rationality and reason, because in different disciplines and in different cultures, they are used very differently. So let me give you working definitions of these two crucial concepts. Rationality, I would define as the ability to come to increasingly precise analytical descriptions of an issue. So rationality is a capability of human thinking that allows us for this kind of analytical zoom in into the details with increasingly precise distinctions. Reason, which often, even in philosophy today, is used almost synonymously with rationality, is here perceived as something fundamentally different. Reason, with a definition of Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, a philosopher and physicist who was one of the closest collaborators of Heisenberg and Bohr, who was incidentally also a philosopher and physicist. He once defined reason as the ability to appreciate an issue in its entirety. I think it's a very nice and elegant definition. Reason as the ability to appreciate something in its entirety. And as we already see from these two definitions, rationality per se, as this zoom-in capability, does not necessarily allow us then also to reintegrate the findings into a meaningful overall picture. So I think there's a fundamental difference between rationality and reason. And I would argue that our present civilization is characterized by a certain hypertrophy of rationality at the expense of reason, and I'm trying to substantiate that a bit later. Just one more introductory remark, and then we go into the overview where what I'm going to talk about. I'm coming from an institute, the Parmenides Center for the Study of Thinking, which was established 12 years ago with the idea to bring all those disciplines together that today can contribute on our understanding of the human faculty of complex thinking. These are by now 7 or 8 disciplines. One of them, and a colleague from the center is here present, Ersat Mari, an outstanding evolutionary biologist. So the disciplines range from evolutionary anthropology, evolutionary biology, through all the usual suspects, from the neurosciences all the way down to philosophy. And the motivation why we created that center in cooperation with the University of Munich 12 years ago was to combine 2 questions. One is to study the foundations of thinking, how thinking actually works and how it's implemented in the human brain. And on the other hand, to study at the same time the frontiers of thinking, so foundations and frontiers. By frontiers, we mean things where human thinking runs into problems today, like when confronted with high levels of complexity, like confronted with certain findings in theoretical physics. So where our kind of usual habits how to think come at their limits. And the idea was that by studying both the foundations and the frontiers, the 2 questions might mutually shed some light on each other. And this is also the way how I'm now going to tackle that. Just one more remark on the character of the transparencies. I produce them usually in a way that one can, at a later stage, read them again, and they are kind of self-explaining like a paper. So we will not go through every text part of the presentations. And the main emphasis of all these transparencies is to show how the reasoning process, what the reasoning architecture is that leads us to a certain argument. And I must say, as a philosopher, not as a physicist, but it's such a pleasure to read, for example, the original publications of Einstein, because they are so elegantly in describing the way how he comes to a conclusion and how he thinks. And I think this is really an art. And so in a way, these transparencies just try to follow this approach and to make clear how the reasoning actually works. So I will also jump about a number of things that are on the transparencies, but those who are interested can read them later. Let me just start with a quote. Some of you will know from whom that is. The missing link between big apes and Homo sapiens, that is us. The man who said that was Konrad Lorenz. And I think it's a very interesting expression of modesty. The title Homo sapiens is really a big name. And I think we still, as a species, have really to develop into fulfilling that great name and that great title in a way. What I would now like to do is to give you an overview about the structure of the argument that I'm going to present. And I don't have a device to, is there any pointer? Sorry? If there is one? Anyhow, while we are searching it, I think I can. I can also use this one here on in the computer. What I'm going to talk about at the beginning is a finding that is quite relevant for understanding our present problems with scientific theories that we have, and this is the existence and relevance of something that was called categorical apparatus. So, thank you very much. What's a categorical apparatus? Since Immanuel Kant, we know that one can, in epistemological terms, not be completely naive and assume that when we think about reality, all that appears to us is one-to-one what is, so to speak, out there, or as he called it, the thing in itself. Kant's assumption was that, for example, space and time, and at his times, he obviously had a kind of Newtonian notion of space and time in mind when saying that. They, for him, were preconditions of making structured experiences. And I think following Kant's line in this epistemological reflection, but then adding what has been found in the basic research of the 20th century mainly, specifically in theoretical physics, we have to develop this approach further. And the notion of a categorical apparatus refers, as we will see in a few minutes, to certain kind of symmetry breakings, cognitive symmetry breakings in our approach to reality, which we automatically make and which often create problems in our theories, and which we better become aware of and then integrate them into our theories. So the argument is that by reflecting the existence and the role of these categorical apparatus, we get to a point where we can then develop a somewhat richer categorical framework that allows us to appreciate aspects of reality that hitherto we had greatest problems struggling with. What I'm going to introduce, is that readable? Not really. Okay, that's a pity, but I'll try. At least you see the structure, and I'll say what stands here, what's written here. So here is the crucial point here is this notion of an autogenetic universe. And I'll define in a second what that means. Essentially, it's a universe that unfolds in and out of itself, and that has certain features which we're going to look into in a few seconds. What that brings is a rather interesting novel perspective on some of the fundamental questions which we are struggling with in modern science. And the basic argument in this regard is that unless we unveil the existence and role of these categorical apparatus, in Latin that's a plural, one can also say apparator, but correctly it would be apparatus with a long U. So unless we recognize the existence and role of these underlying, every theory is built on an underlying categorical apparatus, and unless we recognize that, we have big problems sometimes in reconciling, for example, the most fundamental theories in modern physics, quantum physics and general relativity. And from unearthing these underlying categorical apparatus, one gets an interesting new perspective on them. On the other hand, it also is of major implications, as we will see in a few minutes, for understanding human cognition, what's the essence of it, etc. And then out of that comes the ability to develop methodologies, thank you very much, that support the human brain in dealing with complexity. We call them cognitive excellence technologies. And out of those, then an entire suite of possibilities follows, from supporting different fields, from education, strategy. We're not going to go into this in all detail. I'm just showing you a few examples what follows from this approach. So you see here the two parts of this argument, which I'm going to make the blue part, which is more the theoretical, philosophical part, and then, as we are here in a technical university, the practical consequences of this. I think I jump, in order to not waste too much time over these introductory remarks, and we go right into the idea of an autogenetic universe. As I said, the founding idea of the Parmenides Foundation was to combine the study of the foundations and frontiers of thinking, so how it actually works and where it runs into problems. And only when you ask in this double question, I think some of the things that I'm going to argue become visible. Without that specific question, it's difficult to see them. What do I mean by an autogenetic universe? That is just a standard picture. I think it's from NASA, where an initial singularity is portrayed, and then out of that, the universe as we know it unfolds. And Martin Rees was so kind to yesterday give us some very interesting and telling insights into what happens in this process. Now, but what characterizes our universe is that out of that emerges an entity, human beings, that start to reflect on that entire process. And this is a rather interesting feature. And if we look at it in structural terms, the thing starts to become self-relevant, self-referential in a very interesting way. The whole process starts to become, in a way, if we consider ourselves to be part of that universe, the process starts to become aware of itself and reflect upon itself. And so the definition of an autogenetic universe is one that unfolds out of itself, within itself, and towards itself. That doesn't mean that necessarily those processes have this capability to eventually reflect upon themselves, but at least we find ourselves to exist in a universe in which this is obviously possible. Now, what that picture also tells us is that all this does not occur within local space-time. And coming back to my argument about Immanuel Kant, that's what he assumed automatically as a given in his century. But what we know today is that the emergence of local space-time is actually part of this unfolding. So we make a mistake, a major category mistake, if we portray all of that already in the framework of a given local space-time background. The problem is that this strong self-referentiality and this autogenetic character is not really structurally compatible with most of the theories that we utilize today in science. As some of you know who have been working in informal disciplines, we have huge problems with the structure of strong self-referentiality, just to name Gödel here. On the other hand, we have problems with understanding autogenetic unfolding, which we assume here for the beginning, but most of our theories do not take into account that this very autogenetic origin may affect everything that happens thereafter. And just jumping ahead, I would argue that what we see and why we struggle so much with quantum physics is because it's exactly the same thing. It's autogenetic unfolding that still occurs in reality all the time. And that, however, with the very structure of our theories, we have problems to digest and to cope with. So what I'm going to talk about is how can we develop a conceptual and a categorical framework that allows us to better deal with autogenetic unfolding and strong self-referentiality. Just one word on the notion categorical. Some time ago, I published a paper in the old and famous journal Annalen der Physik, and the title was about new categorical foundations. And what happened there is that they mixed up the title in the last proofreading, so I could not correct it any longer, and it now reads categorical foundations. But categorical refers, at least in the philosophical tradition, to the categorical imperative, which is a practical philosophical principle. But what I'm talking about is categorial, and that refers to the underlying categories of our thinking. So please be aware, even those very famous and historically very influential journals sometimes get that wrong. Now, I would argue that at present, our thinking and most of our scientific theories are trapped into something that I would call a facticity imprisonment. What does that mean? How did that historically develop? If we go back in the history of our thinking, we see that specifically Aristotle brought an enormous jump forward in terms of systematizing and concretizing structured thinking. But in a way, that step and that jump was so ingenious that we tend to oversee its structural implications, namely a certain way to reduce reality to its factual aspect and time to its sequential structure. And as I will try to argue, this is a bit deprived and narrow version of time and reality. And in order to understand certain phenomena that also relate to emergent complexity, not to existing, but to emergent complexity, we need to widen kind of our scope of thinking and these underlying categorical apparatus. So just to go very quickly through that, this symmetry breaking, this, so to speak, Aristotelian symmetry breaking allowed us to develop this very powerful analytical science and closely related to that Western technology. But it also had its costs in reducing reality and our notion of time to a certain aspect. And as you will see, it there relates to the outstanding lecture we just had before our break, because what there was called the sacred and this realm is maybe an aspect of reality that we cannot avoid, and that is in a way inherent to reality. And so that is just an interesting link, which I obviously was not aware before I heard this interesting lecture before the coffee break. So the important thing is that this symmetry breaking, very deep down in the categorical foundations of our thinking, have quite huge scientific costs, because there are two ways of looking at modern science. On the one hand, we can see all this dramatic progress which we make. On the other hand, we also can say, but some of the big open issues, we don't really make progress since at least 100 years. We are not able to reconcile the foundational theories of modern physics. We still struggle with the phenomenon of life, and we have no clue how consciousness actually works. So I think despite all this enormous progress which we made, there are also some open questions, one could even say open wounds, in the very deep questions that modern science seems rather incapable of addressing adequately. And I think that has to do with not really reflecting these categorical foundations. On the other side, we also have worldly costs. And let me just, in a nutshell, make that argument, because I today don't want to go deeper into that. If we perceive time and reality in this facticity imprisonment, we perceive time essentially as something that pulls everything away from us. We perceive time under this linear sequential effect of everything, pulling everything away. Just to take a metaphor, if you imagine to stand at the end of a train, then everything you see runs away and is pulled away from you. And the logical reaction, the counter reaction to this very specific perception of reality is our focus on power, possession, and control. These most essential drivers of modern civilization are actually, I would say, counter reactions to perceiving time as something that inevitably pulls everything away from us. Now, coming back to the metaphor with the train, you could also imagine to stand at the front end of the train, and then everything comes towards you. It unfolds permanently, and the most stupid thing you could do would be to cling to things, because you would stop the entire process. And sometimes I think that in Asian cultures, still more of that front end of the train perspective survived, and that we in our more Western Occidental cultures kind of optimized the end of the train perspective, with great success, but also with some really painful structural deficits. And so my hunch is that here, the deficits which we see in science in addressing these most fundamental issues, and the deficits with our civilization and its self-threatening character have to do with each other and are interrelated via this kind of deprived perception of reality, which we are now going to address in more detail. So if we want to understand an autogenetic universe, we have three perspectives, it is argued here. There is this factual portrait of time and reality. Facts here are seen as the traces of the actual taking place. Facts are not and cannot represent the actual taking place in itself. They represent the traces as they appear on the canvas of local space-time. So local space-time here in this interpretation is seen as the co-emergent canvas that corresponds to the factual aspect of reality. Then a second aspect is this actual taking place, this autogenetic self-unfolding, and that requires a completely different conceptual framework to be addressed properly. And we will go into that in a second. And then there's even a third perspective when we look at something in its entirety, which here is called the apeiron portrait, referring to another pre-Socratic philosopher who introduced this very interesting notion of apeiron. Peiros in ancient Greek means border, and it's often erroneously translated as infinite. What it actually means, it's inherently borderless, it's inherently structuraless. So there is an apeiron perspective, which then is very close to what you described as the sacred. Now, my argument would be that all these three perspectives are aspects how we can look at time and reality, and unless we realize that with our choice, whether we go for the blue version, for the blue glasses, for the green, or for the yellow glasses, we cannot make sense of certain things in reality. What I want to do now is to go into one more point, and this is a little technicality, but I think a quite interesting one. The topology of Borromean, so-called Borromean rings, is a very interesting topology because it means that these three rings are interrelated in a way that if you take away one of them, the other two just fall apart as completely separated. So they're not linked, but only via the third, all three hang together. And this applies in all permutations. So it's a very interesting structure, and one cannot represent it with a purely two-dimensional model because it's inherently three-dimensional in order to make it work. But these rings exist, you can build them and look at them. And whenever you take away one of them, the other two, as I said, fall apart in a pure duality. That is philosophically quite interesting because it allows us to get beyond the traditional structures of a monistic or dualistic ontology and introduces a new way how to reconcile this very old philosophical problem of combining and interrelating unity and difference, which usually in the tradition of philosophy has been always decided by flipping on one side. Or you go to a monistic description or you go to a dualistic description. But I think you get out of that dilemma only by such a trilateral construct. That's also why this novel approach is called reality account. Now let's go into more details regarding these underlying categorical apparatus. So the first one that corresponds to facticity consists of four elements which are closely interrelated. It's a tertium non datur logic, in modern terms a Boolean logic. It's a sequential aspect of time. It's a principle of causality, and it's a dichotomy between subject and object. And what can be shown, what actually was the theme of my philosophical doctoral thesis 30 years ago, is that these are interrelated in a way that you cannot take away one of them without also harming the others. if you imagine you take away sequential time, you cannot maintain causality. If you take away tertium non datur logic, you also cannot maintain a clear-cut causal structure, etc. So the argument here is that beyond what Kant said, but following the same thrust of the argument, we have to recognize that certain theories are based on this categorical foundations, and if we don't realize them, we cannot possibly understand what happens beyond this. So what does the second apparatus look like? It has the identical structure. We have here a way how to make predications or a predication space. We have here an aspect of time. We have here a way how events are interrelated, and we here have a basic epistemological setting. Now, the other apparatus, and you cannot possibly just modify that or drop that. For example, in the early stage of quantum physics, Heisenberg tried to drop causality, but it didn't work because you cannot just isolate one of the four and still work with it in the same way. So if we want to get beyond the limitations of that framework, we have to change all four in a way that is inherently consistent. And now what we see here is we get to a paratactical predication space. Parataxis as a technical term means that you can have different propositions staying side by side, and only together they constitute the overall meaning. We know that from poems. In a poem, for example, you can say, I love her and I don't love her, and the actual message is the combination of the two. So a paratactical predication space is tolerant of contradictions. The price that you have to pay for that is that you cannot make formal conclusions or derivations, because then you get into the so-called ex falso sequitur quodlibet catastrophe, where you can derive every nonsense. So we have to give up kind of formal conclusions, but we gain the phenomenon of mutual semantic unfolding, which is, can be then more technically described in the logic of constellations. Time has a very different feature here. It's inherently, as one would say in modern terms, it's a non-local notion of time. Time is a time-space in which the various aspects kind of, you cannot chop up time in these typical sequential slices, but you have to more to look at it as a space, as a time space, as we also use the notion, the time space of the present. And then we have this phenomenon of autogenetic unfolding, which we saw in the picture from the universe, where something now not in a causal way, but it unfolds in and out of itself. The best metaphor for that that I can think of is the unfolding of a flower. So there you would say that unfolds in and out of itself, and it becomes more itself, so to speak. This is the essence of that notion. And then you can show, formally even, that the structure of strong self-referentiality and this phenomenon of autogenetic unfolding are like twins. So the structure of strong self-referentiality is kind of the structural portrait of autogenetic unfolding, and autogenetic unfolding is the procedural portrait of strong self-referentiality. So that constitutes a second aspect of, or a second way how to look at time and reality in its own right. And it's, as we will see, complementary to that. And I would argue, and I'm again jumping ahead to a later conclusion, that the reason why quantum physics creates so much problems is because we always try to look at it in this framework. As soon as you try to represent a process of autogenetic unfolding in this factual framework, you're looking through the glasses that don't fit. And therefore we have these, we are struggling with that since so many years, since a century almost. And quite interesting now is the third aspect, the third, as I call it, chrono-ontological portrait of time and reality. And this is this apeiron portrait, where, as you see, these are very clear-cut separate. These are already closer. Here, the four elements kind of merge. And if you want to describe the four positions, the predication, which we had here, you get into omnipredicability. The time, place is filled, the slot is filled with this omnipresence, omnipotentiality, and omnidentity. These are exactly the features that in almost all branches of cultural evolution of mankind are attributed to the notion of God or the sacred, etc. The argument here is that this is a way to look at reality in its own right, which needs to be respected. There's only one rock-hard limitation here, and that is from this way, you cannot possibly derive any conclusions, and you cannot possibly force your own way of seeing things upon anybody else. So this is where all religion, I would argue, immediately loses all its rights when they start to impose something as if they were talking in this manner. And this, I think, is where a lot of the problems in intercultural relations come from. If people try to argue about this aspect of time and reality, which is a legitimate one, but if they pretend they would be arguing like in the blue description. Now, what is interesting, that all those things that make life worthwhile, like the experience of sense and meaning, beauty, love, joy, etc., have to do with all three. If we reduce ourselves to this portrayal of reality, we lose a lot, and we get into this deprivation, which we then try to compensate by the over-fixation on power, possession, and control. So some complementary observations, and one relates to natural language. Natural language is, unlike it is perceived in analytical philosophy, it is characterized, and it's quintessential for natural language, to have a certain tolerance for contradictions and for semantic unfolding. The ideal to make it all well-defined would immediately make us lose the ability to address these other aspects. So I would argue that natural language is, the secret of natural language is the combination, an extremely balanced, evolutionary developed balance between the principle of semantic constancy, without which we could not communicate, and the principle of semantic unfolding, which allows us to address autogenetic unfolding and authentic coming into being. And I think a lot of, at least in the first half of the last century, a lot of this thrust on getting things well-defined and formalize them misses completely the point, the essence and the secret of natural language. There are some other aspects. I only want, for the sake of the time, to look at this last one, because that's an aspect I like very much about this whole conceptual framework. Usually we have a contradiction between explainability and wonderfulness. And I don't believe that this really exists. Here we have a portrayal of reality in which explainability and wonderfulness deepen mutually. So it's, and my impression is that when reading the great physicists of the last century, they all had this, the really important ones, had this deep feeling of wonderfulness, an irreducible wonderfulness, despite our scientific efforts to explain reality. And I would even go to say they deepen mutually. The more we understand about reality, the more it is wonderful, and vice versa. So this is a rather different framework. Now I'm coming to something that goes a bit more into the details of the way how we make predications in the green apparatus. And as an example, I take a haiku poem from Bashu, which was one of the greatest writers of poems. And the whole poem reads, "Quietness at noon, cicadas cry, rock penetrating." This is the whole poem. And in order to make it work, we actually need, and we do even experimental neuroimaging tests with this poem, which are very interesting and telling and show the difference between how the brain works in a ratiomorphic mode and how it works in a constellatory mode. So the whole poem only starts to work once these start to unfold mutually their meaning. So we have quietness, the cicadas cry, and the penetration of the rocks. And then this quietness as we can all imagine when we carefully listen to this wonderful poem, it becomes much more intensive through this intermittent cicada's cry, and then it stops. Huh? Okay. Thank you. So I have to hurry up a bit. So there's a mutual intensification and a semantic unfolding between these three. And if you look at it in a closer way, you see there are three subphases or subdynamics. One is this mutual semantic unfolding. Then all of a sudden, and you see that in the brain, an overarching picture emerges of the entire scene. And then eventually, the initial constituents are reinterpreted in this phase 3 by this overarching, or from the point of view of this overarching scene. And there the process starts to be looped back into itself, and it then can have a very interesting kind of ongoing semantic unfolding between the components. What is interesting to observe is that similar dynamics of semantic unfolding are at the heart of art, whatever it is. And they don't only occur in kind of aesthetic associations, but they also occur, we think, and we seem to see in our experiments, on the level of highly abstract conceptual construals. So from a Newtonian physics approach to a relativistic approach, there is no ratiomorphic transition path, but what actually happens is that the old paradigm fragments, and then from a bird's eye perspective, what had to be done is to reconcile and reposition the various fragments and to fill the loops. So it's we think that fundamental scientific innovation is essentially also an constellatory process, or to put it in other words, cognitive excellence is always related to a smooth interplay between ratiomorphic reasoning processes and these constellatory reasoning processes. And that's a difference, for example, to the approach that Kahneman and others took when you argue that these constellatory processes could not be executed on the level of abstract construals. But as I was warned that time is running, I just want to jump to two conclusions. One relates to the trial to interpret quantum physics. And I think there's almost a compass rose of options to pull a blanket that is inherently too short. Just imagine you're lying in a bed and there's a blanket that is a bit short. And you can or cover your feet or your head, or etc. But in whatever position you move it, it's always somehow too short. And I think when we look at the history of trying to interpret quantum physics, we exactly see the trial to move it around and to test all those positions. So there's one where you say reduction is trivial, it's just non-locality. Some defenders of Bohm, I think Bohm himself was much richer in his thinking, argue that way. Then you have reduction as triggered by processes, for example, gravity. Karol Házy, an outstanding Hungarian physicist, and Penrose argued that way, or argues still that way. You can then have reduction as just an epistemic phenomenon, or you can say there's no reduction, the world is just splitting all the time in an Everett picture, which from a philosophical point of view is utterly ugly. It's too ugly to be true, because then you kill your grandmother and you don't kill it, and all things. So it kind of washes down a lot of the meaning of life, at least in my view. Now you see some in-between positions that emerge here, and eventually you can show that all of them have some deficits, and the argument would be that the problem here is not that all these outstanding scientists and greatest minds of the last century would not have figured out how it works. The problem is that we were not aware of these underlying categorical apparatus which predetermine what we can see inside these theories, and therefore we didn't come to a conclusion in that regard. Now, what would that mean if that now is turned into the positive, into a constructive approach. Let me just give you very briefly an idea of what is argued from that conceptual framework developed here. You would say that we have now these three perspectives on reality. These are these three ways of framing time and reality. The statu nascendi, this apparent picture, and the factual picture. And what we would argue, and I'm working with a group, I have the privilege to work with a group of outstanding mathematical physicists at the Parmenides Center, is what we try to do is to describe quantum reduction as the way how reality comes from that picture into that one, how local space-time picture, how the factual picture of reality kind of comes into being. And then interestingly, you can argue that we even see in the second major foundational theory of modern physics in general relativity, the inverse transition, where in singularities, at least in one way of looking at singularities, this local space-time background, this local space-time canvas kind of melts down again, and this characteristic features of facticity in that way are lost again, and we get back into this process. So that also would explain why we had so big problems in reconciling general relativity and quantum physics if we only apply this way of looking at reality. The argument is you need to be able to separate these three chrono-ontological aspects in order to understand that these two theories describe inverse transitions into local spacetime and out of local spacetime. But that's very immature and at a preliminary stage. Just for those of you who are interested, that's how we technically approach it. We try to say that we need a third step in quantum theory where we relativize the local space-time background. The same here. We call that categorical relativity, when even the kind of local space-time background is relativized. And then the argument is that through these two third steps, you can really make them converge. And then comes this theory of autogenetic networks, which is the mathematical theory that is just being elaborated. Now let me jump to a conclusion because time is running and I promise to not talk over, or at least not much over an hour. What that results in, and maybe we can later in the discussion come back to the novel perspective on human cognition that this brings. What that basically results in is the following theory architecture. You take this phenomenon of autogenetic unfolding and you move it into the core of your description of reality, and then you can say we have first order autogenesis, which explains how physical reality constitutes. Out of that, you get to second order autogenesis when material elements come in certain configurations that again such an autogenetic phenomenon emerges on a second order. And then that's what would try to explain how life comes into being. And then here one would make a separation between consciousness and self-awareness. So then certain animals gain the quality, acquire the quality of having an internal representation of their outside world. And that's when you get into the sphere of consciousness. And finally, when you become aware of yourself, you get there. And then all these eschatological questions emerge at that level that you have been mentioning. Okay, let me now come to the practical aspects. Because if it is correct that reality continues to autogenetically unfold, so that the basic feature of this initial unfolding is still present in all of reality, then we obviously need ways to address that and tools to describe that. And this is the practical part of it. And here we're moving now from theoretical insights to practical applications. And what you need is the ability to have a synoptic representation of this unfolding process. Because if you just chop it up, you don't see the elegant move of this unfolding, the dynamics of it. What you also need is you need option spaces to represent how this unfolding actually takes place. In a minute, we are going to see it in practical examples. It then allows you to form those so-called coherently navigable knowledge spaces. And finally, you have a specific matching process which brings something like, it's a formal version of trying to approximate what we perceive as elegance and beauty. And that can then be applied to various fields. And I'm now just going to show you a few screenshots how that is actually today done and how it's used. Let me start with this here. As an example, how to help the human brain to understand constellations and to think in constellations. Can we reduce the light a bit? Then it's at least somewhat better. Great. So this is what we call a molecule. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that by putting these elements, this is from a strategic thinking process, a government advising process that took place already years ago for the government of Nelson Mandela. And these are kind of the challenges which the cabinet at the time identified. You can have a look at them in this way. So these are all the things that they had on their plate and they defined to be relevant for them. And then what you technically do, you just simply look at the correlations of those phenomena, whether they're positively in achieving their goals correlated or negatively. And out of that, you have a higher dimensional object, which you project down in this three-dimensional graph. And that, it turns out, helps the human brain to digest something in its complexity. And I think for intercultural communication or so, it's very important to see actually the constellation of elements so that the brain is supported in this mode of mutual semantic unfolding by seeing them at the same time. If you don't use this way of representing it, you read one, you read the other, you read at best the third, but it's very hard for the brain to see the entire complexity of the issue and allow for that mutual semantic unfolding to occur in parallel for all those. So these are not graphs that tell you the answer, they just should support the human brain in dealing with high levels of qualitative complexity. Coming back to some other elements, and as time is running, I show you one last example, and it is that one, because we started to utilize constellatory logic for supporting medical diagnostics. And let me just quickly show you. I brought the device here, so if anybody is interested to have a look at it, how it actually works, we can later look into that. Just to give you a brief overview here. This is what you see on an iPad, and the medical doctor just pulls in the symptoms that he or she sees in a patient. And now, unlike in traditional medical expert systems, this constellatory logic is used. That means that the meaning of every individual symptom only unfolds in the presence of those other symptoms that are there at the same time. So what we try to represent in the system is this mutual semantic unfolding. And we would argue that no good medical doctor looks at his or her patient just as a list of symptoms and ticks them off and makes a Boolean combination. But the essential point in the cognitive aspect of that is to really allow for that mutual semantic unfolding. And the architecture of that is as follows. This is what is used. In the background, you have a medical description language which had to be developed, which then feeds into this semantic unfolding. One can also recognize how the system thinks, so that's a big difference to what, for example, Watson is doing. And then you can use it. The field where we started to use it in the university clinic is in a medical field where up to now severe vertigo diseases, where up to now about 80% of the initial diagnosis were wrong. And even 50% of the second diagnosis were wrong. And now using this constellatory logic, we get to rates above, in the meantime, even above 93, 95% hit rate at the very first situation, at the very first diagnostic situation. So that is just to show that what I tried to describe as a means to support the human brain in better appreciating all three aspects of reality is not only of theoretical interest, but has also some practical relevance. In the meantime, there are 80 people just working on that project because it seems to be so promising. Well, so much on the move from pure rationality to reason. Reason is never in contrast to rationality. It just goes far beyond it, and I think the big challenge of our epoch is to start realizing that and to actively make that move from pure rationality to reason. Thank you very much. 3 Minuten, ja? So we're open for questions.
Hi, thanks for that talk. You have a very, it's a very ambitious picture, right? You have a very sort of, it's a complicated picture, I guess. And I was just wondering, I mean, so you think you want to think of it as, do you want to think of it as an extension of the Kantian project? That is, so Kant, right? I mean, you were talking about Kant, and he, you know, the way I think about Kant is that he's trying to work out sort of so Kant realizes that, okay, you need, the human mind works in such a way that you need these categories to constitute reality. And then Kant's asking in the critique, he's asking, okay, what are the categories that are necessary in order to have the science that we have today, right? Which is Newtonian science for Kant. Now, in the 20th century, right, there were people that came along and said, okay, well, the Kantian picture is sort of, the mistake of Kant is that he sort of had this, he had this a priori foundation that was sort of an absolute foundation. That is, he thought, okay, this has to be the foundation for everything. But people came along in the 20th century that sort of said, no. Maybe we need foundations for doing science, but you could shift those foundations. People like Kuhn came along and said, okay, well, maybe you need these sort of, you might call them a priori structures, but you can shift them, right? That's the Kuhnian picture. Also, people like Carnap also had a picture like this, right? And so I guess I'm asking, okay, you have a very ambitious picture. Are you saying that this picture is supposed to, does it form sort of an absolute foundation in the Kantian way, or does it, now you want to say something like there's 3 sort of sets of categories, right? And so maybe I'm trying to think about what you're saying here, right? And maybe you're saying that, okay, there are sort of 3 sets of categorical foundations that are each sort of all sort of legitimate, and you could shift between them, but they're all as real as each other, or something like that. I mean, so what is the, I mean, well, yeah, what is the general thing that you're trying to do here?
I think it's a very good question, and I'm happy to answer it. I think you're right. One would today no longer postulate kind of absolute foundations of how reality can be perceived. Okay, so the Kantian trust or the Kantian tradition in which that trial stands is to reflect how we perceive reality. It's not to postulate kind of an absolute foundation. These 3, I would argue, is some ways that you experience in all branches of the cultural evolution of mankind, something that relates to these three different ways of categorizing time and reality can be found. And there comes the point where I would turn things around. Take, for example, our experience of the present. In today's standard scientific picture, we see there is the sequential time. This is the objective physical time, whether it's we have a relativistic picture or another one, but this is kind of what's out there. And then we, as human beings, confabulate the experience of a time space of the present in which we seem to exist and in which we perceive ourselves. I would turn things at that point around, because in evolutionary terms, half our brain is involved in constructing that present. This construct would long have been thrown out by evolutionary selection if it wouldn't hit something, if it wouldn't mean something. So I would like to turn it around and to say, what if our experience of the present is a cognitive adaptation to the actual taking place of reality? So it's not a confabulation, it's an adaptation, an evolutionarily selected adaptation to the way how reality actually occurs. So instead of postulating these three as kind of a priori given absolutes, I think we can derive them as ways that in the evolution of cognition turned out to be very helpful in order to manage with that, and therefore they should tell us something about what's out there. And therefore I would argue that this typical Husserl type or other reconstruction of a subjective present as a confabulation is probably utter nonsensical, because it would have been thrown out by cognitive evolution anyhow in the meantime. So that's an argument where you kind of empirically base and derive these three complementary chrono-ontological portraits. I hope I answered your question somewhat.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to make one comment and then one question. First, you said that the apeiron concept applies, apeiron concept applies to most religions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think this is true. For instance, if you take the Greek gods,
Mm-hmm.
were certainly not omnipresent and certainly not omnipotent. And of course, and this also can be told about other religions, including religions here in Asia. And also it's interesting that Greeks didn't have such a concept of apeiron. Okay, but I think that Greek gods were definitely not omnipotent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second question is, you say, okay, you belong to the Parmenides Foundation, but I wonder if Parmenides was your boss, will kick you out because you look more like close to Heraclitus. Because okay. Parmenides said that there is no change. Heraclitus says that there is constant change, and what you described today look like that you're more close to Heraclitus. Okay. So, what do you think?
Well, let me start with the last question, because I really like it. I think there's one of the most interesting papers about the relation between Heraclitus and Parmenides is entitled "The Hidden Twins." Not the hidden connections, but the hidden twins. And what Weichedel in that paper shows is that in a way, one is kind of the inverted version of the other one. So the claim of permanent change, as in Heraclitus, and the key notion in the philosophy of Heraclitus is the logos. And the logos actually means, in an original Greek sense, not just logic, but it comes from putting together. Legein means to put things together, putting them into relation, putting them into connections. And so I think that you're right. One can read Parmenides as a very weird theory. For those who have not happened to read him, he argues that essentially all differences are only virtual, and the only thing that really exists is an abstract entity. It's a bit like the universe before the Big Bang. This is kind of the Parmenidean view of what really is. But as Weishedel in the article I mentioned showed very elegantly, the two have very much to do with each other and are kind of one is the inverted form of the other. And but I do agree, I feel a lot of sympathy, and if I would have to choose one author, it would probably be Heraclitus. I think his fragments are some of the richest cultural heritage we have. But now coming to your other point, I think we have to make a distinction within the evolution of religions. And if you look at the origin of the monotheistic religions, which go more in that direction that I indicated, interestingly enough, they all came into being in desert environments. It seems that the desert is really helping abstract thought. I really mean it, because the whole notion of just one God, one principle that we have to find, etc., it emerged empirically in these desert situations. When you have a jungle and there are animals and dangers here and there, you come much more to a kind of pantheistic picture. And I would say the Greek religion was a kind of interesting hybrid, because it was no longer this kind of everything goes pantheism, and it was not yet a monotheistic religion. It was kind of an interesting transition between the two, and the way how gods argue, they reason with each other. So there is already reference to what Heraclitus calls logos in their exchange and in the interaction patterns. So I would see that in the history of religion as an interesting transition phase to that. And I didn't mean to say that it's exactly this kind of monotheistic notion of God that should be related to the Aperon. But it's in perspective of, and I think it's close to what we heard in your fascinating lecture, some kind of eschatological horizon that appears with self-awareness, with this fourth order autogenetic unfolding, that we find ourselves to be mortal, etc., and then these questions appear. And this is where you start to ask for the unity and the meaning of all in its entirety. So I don't mean it too technically narrow.
First of all, I want to congratulate you on doing a very contradictory thing. First, you have dazzled us so that we're all aware of our idiocy. We don't understand you. The second one, which is totally contradictory, is that if you are right, and I think you are right, you've actually reinvented Lao Tzu. Because, you know, a lot of what you're saying is actually a Western analytical framework of Tao Te Ching, Taoism, right? That contradictions evolve within themselves and unfold into a new order, which we do not understand, right? That we are actually inverting, you know, into this reality, and that the failure of today's, not just quantum physics, but Newtonian application in finance theory has created the world today. That, you know, self-greed is presumed to add to public good and has turned out to be a huge public bad, right? So what we need, you know, from your analysis, I think, which I highly encourage you to further develop, is to try and apply, you know, sort of a rereading of Tao Te Ching, you know, which is Taoism, within the framework of the quantum physics, which Fritjof Capra has been trying to do. But unfortunately, this area has been, you know, sort of stopped for quite a while. I really think that you're onto something very, very good.
First, a remark on Capra, and then on the Tao Te Ching. I think Capra is looking in the right direction, but by not doing the hard work of reconstructing the underlying categorical apparatus below the theories. He just does fluffy science. I think when it's really hard work to unearth these underlying categorical foundations below our physical theories. And I don't claim that we're already there, but I'm just making that point. It's no wonder that we don't get the quantum and relativity theory together on that level as long as we portray them only in the blue apparatus. This is my core argument. And I'm not claiming we are there. As I mentioned, this group of mathematical physicists is working very hardly every day, outstanding young brains on doing the math that I can't do because I'm a poor philosopher and I don't have the mathematical skills to do it in the required detail. But I think, so Capra, just to finish that, I think I feel a lot of sympathy with his thinking, but I think we have to do much more serious philosophical work, because the claim here is that, and maybe Martin, you really dislike that, but in a way, I think the problem of today's physics is that unless we unearth these underlying categorical foundations, we don't even know what the theories tell us. That's a kind of post-Kantian question from philosophy to physics. Might it be that the problems are rooted down there? And now to your other point. That was, can you help me again? What? Oh, yes, the Dao De Jing. Yeah, I actually read that with great interest. And also Suzuki, for example, as somebody who tries to bridge the gap between Western thinking and Eastern thinking. And I think the notion of Dao itself describes the principle of self-unfolding. So in a way, I fully agree with what you said. I just think that in order to make these considerations relevant for the modern world, both on the scientific side and on the civilizational side, we have to still do a lot of work in order to make it to bring it in contact with where our thinking stands at present. And therefore, this effort, you could read it as an interpretation of those traditional ways of looking into reality and interpreting it, for which I have greatest respect. So I fully agree with what you said. One should look at it also in a multicultural perspective into this argument. And maybe the Center for Complexity here is a good place to do that.
Oh, I'm just curious. Is there any neurobiological reason, like a neuron or the brain structure, will support this kind of LOC system? Is there any relation?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me tell you what we think, and we are, as I said, there are ongoing series of experiments right now to look at the neural correlations of a thinking that is more into this ratiomorphic mode, the blue mode, or that is more involved in the green mode. And it seems, for example, that there are more long-range activations, more long-range correlations are characteristic for the green mode. And we're just starting series. What we did already is look into this haiku poem and take the same concepts and formulate a normal Boolean question, logical conclusion, and then see how the participants, the subject, how their activation patterns are significantly different when they engage in this phase of mutual semantic unfolding compared when they are in the process of drawing conclusions. And I'm quite sure, it's not yet published, but I'm quite sure that we will get to a rather precise picture of the brain activation differences between these two modes of thinking. And I think not by chance, I'm coming back to my evolutionary argument, I think it's not at all by chance that our brain developed these complementary skills how to look into reality. I think both correspond with some aspects of reality that are really there. So it's not a confabulation. I think it's just a way to cognitively approach certain aspects of the taking place of reality. Let me just make a last remark in answering your question. Isn't it interesting that we say something takes place? Huh? with that step, it becomes part of local space-time. Only via taking place, it comes into being in this factual mode. But the coming into being itself is not something that I could describe with the same categorical framework like the facts that are there. And I think what we miss, and that goes back to the gentleman's question before, what we miss in the Occidental culture, since this Aristotelian symmetry breaking and all the consequences, is an authentic appreciation of this actual taking place as something that cannot be seen through the spectacles of facticity.
Okay, I still try to understand for your question, like whether anything take any place. How can you answer this question by study brain or neuron?
Sorry?
For example, your question, more like a philosophical question, anything take place or not, something like that. To answer that question, we should study neuron or study the brain. I just cannot understand how this kind of brain research would help to answer that philosophy question. How that can be, I mean, maybe through some technology or some approach. I just want to know which method or how we can answer philosophical question using brain research.
Well, I think that all our cognitive activities have neural correlates, okay? That doesn't mean that it's just the neural machinery that drives and our thinking, and that our thinking could be reduced to it. Therefore, I'm explicitly saying there are neural correlates to that. Now, what I'm interested in, my question to the neurosciences is, could you help us in identifying the neural correlates of this specific mode of appreciating time and reality? My hunch is that there will be significantly different signatures in the neural activation patterns if a brain is engaged in this mutual semantic unfolding compared to just following through a well-defined proposition and drawing consequences in a kind of modus barbara mode. And that's the question to the neurosciences. It's not a philosophical proof, but it would be an interesting aspect that we can say because eventually what do we want? We want to look at certain images or sequences of images and say this subject was probably now engaging in listening to a haiku, and this was probably following through some logical operations, some Boolean operations.
Let me continue on that same line of reasoning. Well, thank you very much for this whole talk. It's been very, very enlightening. When I read the title, it was from Rationality to Reason. I did not expect it to follow so much, say, the philosophy of science or the philosophy of physics. Because I would have thought, well, rationality is human behavior, reason, and so on. And I could have imagined it being sort of like concerned about other aspects of the world besides the philosophy of physics. One way of understanding how the brain works that I read not too long ago, and I've been thinking about it, is Jeff Hawkins' book on intelligence, where essentially, what the brain does is it's a fantastic memory system, hierarchical memory with pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. And that what we call concepts and so on and so forth is just a higher level naming mm-hmm. of a sequence of classifiable or associated behaviors. So we would expect that if the brain has this sort of like hierarchical structure, you can ask yourself questions sort of like at different levels in the hierarchy.
Mhm.
But it would be really, really hard to keep all the levels of the hierarchy consistent or at present, so that different levels of emergent complexity would make sense with their own models or approaches and so on, and they would always have trouble with the connection to lower levels or upper levels, but that the attempt to have a sort of like a theory of everything is unlikely to be particularly fruitful, because, say, we might be able to unite gravity with quantum physics, but that's not necessarily going to explain life. Or
yeah. In a way, I think a lot of today's neuroscience tries, and completely legitimately, to reconstruct human cognition as much as they can from this blue portrait, the factual portrait. What can we measure? What can we see, etc.? How do concepts form? It's a kind of Berkeley or whatever nominalistic approach that you can opt for. And I think it's perfectly okay to try as far as one gets with that. But I don't think it's as our self-awareness is so highly self-referential inherently. I think theoretical frameworks that can explicitly not cope with strong self-referentiality will always miss some crucial aspects of the phenomenon they try to address. And I think what you described is layer architecture, and then the problem with correlating all these layers is a typical expression of using kind of a wrong description framework, and therefore you get into all these problems. It's like with epicycles in a way. It's kind of the cognitive science equivalent to epicycles in physics. So you try to use a certain description pattern, and that leads you into more and more complex and complicated descriptions, because you're not applying, you're not really, the way how you describe the phenomenon does not fit with the topology of the problem. And the second point regarding the theory of everything that you mentioned, I think the original idea of a theory of everything that would allow to predict everything, etc., would not make any sense. So I think it's completely legitimate to strive for a coherent but inherently open description of reality. And I would call that a modest Tao. It's modest in explicitly mentioning its own incompleteness. And that also refers to what I said about the complementarity of wonderfulness and explainability. But it's still a valuable, and I think even inevitable goal of science to have a coherent description of reality. So in that sense, I think the aim would be, in fact, a theory of everything, but a very modest one, not a pompous one.